Welcome, everybody. Welcome, my panel. We'll get started right away and just have you all put go around and do an introduction. Tell everybody where you're located and what you do and the name of your company. So let's start with John Fowler.
Thanks, Laureen. Yeah, hi. My name is John Fowler. I'm the CISO at Consilio. I'm based just south of Washington, D.C., but Consilio is a legal services company. We've got about 1,700 employees spread out around the world. We're in 11 different countries, and we provide legal services, electronic discovery, electronic disclosure services to most of the top 100 law firms in the world, a lot of the Fortune 500. We're continually growing, which is one of the things we're going to get into as we talk about best practices. Is how do we account for all this growth? But I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me, Laureen.
Very good. Let's go to Kareem.
Yes, thanks, Laureen. My name is Kareem Briggs. I am from Columbia, South Carolina. I act as the CISO and privacy officer for our South Carolina Department of Disabilities and Special Needs, a state agency serving our citizens with intellectual and related disabilities, whether that's head and spinal cord injuries, autism, and things of that nature. It's just a pleasure to be here on this panel. I'm looking forward to the questions that we have set forth. Thanks, Laureen.
Great. Okay, great. And last, we'll go to Jonathan Kimmitt.
Yeah, thank you, Laureen. Thanks so much for the invite. This is a great opportunity to talk about something that I'm really passionate about, and that's incident response. Jonathan Kimmitt, University of Tulsa. I've been CISO for 7 years here in Northeast Oklahoma, here at the university. But I actually cut my teeth in security through incident response. In the early 2000s, I joined the computer security response team here at the university, and it grew through the ranks up to CISO. So I've been doing this for security response for 15, 16, 17 years now. Everything from very basic machines have viruses. If we go back to the Love Sand days and the virus attacks that came at the beginning of campus every year, all the way up to international incidents. So we've got a wide variety of experiences through incident response.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, companies are really not ever the same again after they've gone through an incident. And Accellion, the company I work for, we've been around 24 years and never had anything happen. But recently, in the last 6 months, we had a significant breach on our legacy product. And you come out of it a different company, a different management team. And I know that firsthand, daily calls. And fortunately, we're on the other side of things. And it's fun for me now because I run CISO Street, and a lot of thought leadership can be done now through the conversations. And one of the things is delivering best practices to companies so they can better prepare. So I'm really excited for the conversation. We're going to break it into kind of three categories or three areas, which is how to prepare, how to respond when you're in an incident, and how to do the postmortem. All three very important categories. So we'll start with how to prepare. I'm going to throw it to John Fowler. And just talk about, the things that you do, because you definitely have a global company that you look after from a security standpoint. Talk to the audience about that, how best to prepare.
Did the same thing.
Everybody on mute.
I think one of the best things, and it's honestly simple when you think about it, is making sure you have some kind of playbook or run book put together. One of the things we've spent a lot of time and effort with on our team internally is ensuring that we have playbooks for incident response purposes that cover every aspect of the business. For instance, we pull in the sales team and talk about, what can the sales team get out? What kind of communications can they get out to clients as we're doing some of the IR activities? What is the ops team doing? I think when an incident occurs, so much is going to be going on, particularly, we're a global company. We have offices spread out in the US, Europe, Asia, India. And when you're in an incident response mode, sometimes people just tend to grab something and start going and going and going. And without that playbook or run book, everyone is not working off the same page. You start getting things done that either are out of order or could potentially harm you further on down in the IR process. And I think one thing that's key, anybody in the audience that is in a global organization, something that we didn't think about initially was getting our playbooks translated into different languages. So we developed the playbook in English, and then we've had it translated into German, into French, into Mandarin, into a number of other languages, so that while they're sitting in the location, the physical location of an office, it's in that location-specific language, so that there's no confusion about what the words mean or what the directions are or what the next steps are.
That is a very good a tip. And that's something that we didn't even talk about in the prep session. So that's really, really good. Let's go to Kareem and talk about what your experience has been and your best practices around how best to prepare.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, kind of echo what John said. Definitely having that playbook is critical. I say I go a step further, or maybe even before that. I do a lot of educating the workforce. I think it's very important for the people in your organization to know what type of threats are out there, what type of situations may be occurring, so they can be your first line of defense when things are coming into your environment. I send out a lot of letters from the CISO's desk, things of that nature, whenever I hear something interesting about a specific threat. That way they can be on the lookout for things that come through their mailbox or any type of situation that may come into play with them. Now, it may result in a lot of calls and emails, because once they get that in their mindset of looking, everything's going to be a little suspicious to them. But I would rather have those emails than have them click on links in emails that could potentially start the IR process for you. So educating the workforce is really big with me.
Very good. And I'll go back to John, but right now we do have a question, and I'm going to go to Jonathan right now to talk about your, what tips you have for how best to prepare. But the question is, should you share your incident response plan with all employees or only the steering committee, IT steering committee? Jonathan.
I think you share it with everyone. I think everyone in the organization needs to understand what the incident response process is. You may not necessarily share every single detail about every single playbook, but you absolutely, every one of your employees may be part of your incident response. They need to know who to talk to, who to communicate with, what to say, what not to say, what to engage, what not to engage. So I think the answer is yes, you do share that with your organization, with your employees, so that they understand what their role in the incident response is.
Very good. Any other tips on how best to prepare? I know we've talked about tabletop exercises and having an effective communication plan, things like that. So maybe we can go into some detail about what's actually in the playbook.
The one thing that I would add to it is you really need to have that true incident response leadership. One of the things that happens in an organization during an incident, or even if it gets to a crisis, if you're doing a crisis management, is you have to have that strong leadership that can keep the organization calm. They can keep everyone, organized in a way that everyone knows what they need to be doing, when they need to be doing it. You also have that single voice that is going out through the communication processes. So the pre-playbook, the actual incident, to really prepare for it, you kind of have to start with that incident response leadership. In a lot of cases, it's an incident response manager, who they are the ones that has the authority. They have the processes, they have the skill set to be able to manage that incident response moving forward. And then for that preparation, that person or persons, there may be multiple people that do it at any one time, they need to pull those playbooks out and go through those tabletops. And people need to see that individual as, okay, that's the one that I need to go talk to. That is a person I need to check in with first before I do anything, before I touch the playbook. Let's give, Jonathan or Kareem or Jonathan a call. It's like, hey, we had an incident, or we have something, what's going on? What do I need to do? In that way, it builds this trust in the community or in the organization that the processes work.
Right.
Yeah, very good. John, so what about the communication plan? I know when we had our incident, it's so easy to get caught up in the, just who do I call? People, customers calling, journalists calling, who should be answering the phone and what should you be saying? I know it's crazy when you're actually in the middle of it. So talk about what you do with the communication plan, how important that is at Consilio.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a bifurcated approach to a communication plan, at least that we take. One is, the client-facing aspect of this, right? We're a private company. So what do we tell our customers? When an incident's occurring, what do we say? Do we just have kind of a standard 2-line, something's happened, stay tuned for more details? I think the key there is we have an excellent working relationship with our sales and marketing teams that are often the relationship managers with our customers. And so we want to put them in a position to give our customers notice. And also, if they want to be the point person for these client inquiries, that's great. But then they have to be funneled into a point person. Jonathan mentioned there has to be that incident response manager. One of the things we try to do is, okay, sales and marketing, who is the person on your team that's going to be that point of contact? So when we have clients calling, emailing, texting, they all get funneled to this person because that's going to be our central repository for what we've communicated to clients. Now, internally, that's again where this incident response manager or management group comes into play, because that's where if an office in Paris says, we've got an incident, what do we need to do? Okay, so that group steps in internally. And thankfully, we have excellent relationships with every part of the business. So we're able to tag a person in every part of the business to be that kind of first responder, so that if there's an incident in Paris, I can call the operations point of contact and say, you're on. Okay, so you need to be the person that the operations team is calling for this incident. So really identifying those people and making sure they know what the communications flow is going to be internally and externally, I think is key in terms of preparing for an incident.
Right. Yeah. And I know that just doing the tabletop exercises frequently is, I know, an important part of that as well. Kareem, anything else that you want to talk about in terms of how to prepare? I want to have John talk about the law enforcement aspect of it as well. And, maybe we can talk about where you would go to get forensics, because that's really important just as part of it, just to have that ready. At the ready.
Yeah, I definitely would like to add on to that, because both John and John have made some great points on engaging with other people outside of just your IR team. You have to know who you're going to engage as far as communications. Like, we have a public information officer. If we're going to start sending out stuff to the public, we want to make sure we follow that through that person, because they have the role of making sure you say the right thing and don't get things stirred up too quickly. It's funny because I just went through a tabletop exercise with IBM. They had a virtual tabletop exercise a couple of weeks ago, and everybody on the call was playing a specific role. So they say, Kareem, you want to do this role? Sure, why not? So you get the call, and it's from a reporter. They said, well, I just heard that there was an incident or a situation at your company. Would you like to respond? And so you have to think on your feet, like, okay, what am I going to say? At that point, you don't really know what's happening. So you don't want to give out too much information. So, you tell them, I'm not at liberty to say anything right now, but we will let you know as soon as we can. because you never know if that event that happened is truly an incident or just something minor. So you definitely want to know who you're dealing with and who you need to engage in the beginning.
Yeah, we have some really good questions that we're going to get to the insurance part in a bit, but there is one question around that. One of the questions is, have you had any luck with integrating a cyber range with your tabletops? I'll just leave that open to anybody to answer.
No, it's a good idea.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. Here's the issue with that. I think depending on how you do your tabletops, you can prepare your cyber range and mimic an attack and mimic an incident that may come up, and then use that as your role playing through your decision making. We don't have a cyber range in that way, so we can't use something like that. It's a good idea. But I think from a playbook or a tabletop exercise, you can get the same effect by looking at incidents in the past, looking at incidents from other organizations, and looking at the details on it. And even if you kind of think about role playing games, where you've got the person who's otherwise saying, okay, this has now happened, now this has happened, and this has happened, just to get people, like what Kareem said, think on your feet. How is this going to go through the process? So I think it's a good idea. I think you can get the same effect by using a couple of other tactics.
Okay, very good. Let's have John share what your thoughts are on the role of law enforcement in preparing for a response.
Sure, throw it to the private company to talk about law enforcement. So, these are conversations, honestly, that I've had internally. I think the first place I went to discuss was with our general counsel, and a very lively discussion about, I think, first, do we call law enforcement? There's kind of a gut reaction. Something happens, call the FBI, call local law enforcement, get them involved right away. But I think, at least from my perspective, there's a period that you need to actually assess, what do we have, what's happening with the company, because once law enforcement is called and once they're brought in, that triggers a complete chain of events where they're going to have to do their investigation. That investigation may or may not fit in with what you've planned out as your IR plan. There are certain things they may do or say or want you to do or say that, depending on how your legal team has looked at the situation or what your executive team wants to do, in my case, they may be completely contrary. And so I think in certain instances, it's prudent to at least sit down and figure out, if we call law enforcement, what will that accomplish? What will that do for us as an organization? Is that the best move? It could be we spend 3 days looking into it on our own, then we call law enforcement, or there's some sort of decision tree that we go through before we ultimately call law enforcement. But I think the primary point here is, my opinion is, it's not just kind of an immediate pick up the phone, call the FBI, hey, problem, come on in.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's really important to have those conversations, ahead of time, and just so that make that decision tree. That's really important. There is a question, I think, about the insurance. I think it's a good time to bring it in. Should you call your insurance carrier before anything else? Jonathan?
The answer is probably. And the reason why I say that is because it depends on the agreement you have with your cyber insurance carrier. In some cases, the agreement you have says you will notify them immediately. Other cases, it depends on what your coverage is. If you don't call your insurance immediately, so the way our cyber insurance works, it may be similar to what other people do, maybe completely different since we're higher education. If an incident has happened, we are required to immediately call our cyber insurance. They put us on with a breach coach. it goes through the process to say, okay, what are the next steps? Now, this is all while we're still doing the stuff internal at the university, but we have a breach coach, which is generally a law firm, is contracted through the cyber insurance that helps us through, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3. And we do that to make sure that the insurance is involved to cover any cost. So if you have a requirement based off your insurance, yes, you need to call them. If you think insurance is going to eventually be involved to pay for, fixing the problem or notifications, or there's criminal or civil liability out there, then yes, maybe you should. It kind of goes into the law enforcement that John was talking about. There are certain things that, if it's dealing with human safety, or if it's dealing with, criminal acts, yes, I feel like you should involve in law enforcement very quickly. But I had a trainer, an instructor once, who was telling us that you can't look at that sort of a decision through the eyes of your organization. You have to look at it from the eyes of the judge or the jury that may be deciding something 2 years from now. Why did an organization wait for 5 days before they contacted someone? What would it look like to the public? What would it look like to a judge? So a lot of cases, at least here from the university's perspective, general counsel and I, we sit and we talk about that. It's like, okay, in this situation, if we don't involve law enforcement, if we don't involve cybersecurity insurance, what is the negative effect of that 6 months down the line, 2 years down the line, and so on, because that can make a huge impact on the organization.
Kareem, what are your thoughts on the insurance piece of it? Is that something that you take into account in your playbooks and things like that in your discussions?
Yeah, definitely so. I think another thing you can look into when you're contacting your cyber insurance carrier. A lot of times your coverage includes a bucket of hours from a dedicated IR team. If you don't want to speak to the carrier itself as far as coverage wise, you can at least reach out to that IR team to get some guidance on what you're going through, to see if you're really, having something significant enough to start using your coverage. So take advantage of those resources that come along with your coverage.
Yeah, there's a question I'm going to ask it in just a second. It was sent to me privately, so I don't think you see it. But I think, what you're both saying about the insurance is, make sure that you understand what the contract says, right? What you agree to, what's in your policy. The question is, it may be, okay, to get to insurance, what will be the limits that insurance companies will be legally allowed to cover in the cases of ransomware, where there is no other option for the victim to pay to get the keys, at least for some of the information that was encrypted? And maybe that goes to what's actually in your policy. I don't know if there's a blanket statement you can say about, what the liability coverage is for ransomware, or what the coverage is for ransomware. Yeah,
that's definitely going to all depend on your coverage, as well as whatever the processes you have in place with your organization. If you have some type of ransomware playbook in play with your organization, that can sometimes lower the cost for that particular coverage, because they see that you're serious about what you're doing and that you have these technical aspects in place to try to prevent things from happening.
Yeah, that's really a good point. So one of the things that's happening right now is insurance companies, we're just going through a renewal right now for us. And the insurance companies have sent applications that are much more detailed than they've ever been.
Yeah.
And the reality is, when you start looking at ransomware, there's a lot, and insurance companies are paying out ransoms, maybe not even ransoms specifically, but the cleanup and all of the ancillary costs of doing that. So they want to make sure that the organizations are going through their standard steps. One of the things that they asked us, very recently was, do we have MFA on all of our systems?
Mm-hmm.
All of the systems. That means all of the computers and everything. And, I know why they're asking that is because if you have multi-factor, it's possible that, if a compromised account can't get on the computer to infect it and this and that and whatever. So I understand completely. Well, MFA is still fairly new. Organizations have not moved to domain added machines. They haven't moved to some of their switch equipment. They haven't moved some of their backups to MFA. Should they? Yes. I would say as a CISO, we would want to do that, but that's a lot of cost and a lot of effort. So you start looking at it from the insurance perspective. It's like, well, you didn't have MFA on there. That's industry standard or minimum viable security for protecting against these threats, and you did not have that, then you're not necessarily covered for coverage on that. So you have to be really careful. You have to understand what's in your insurance, understand what the contract says, and understand what coverage you have to know what you need to be doing in your organization to meet those requirements.
Yeah, I'm going to have, go ahead, Kareem, then I'll
No,
to John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's pretty much like health insurance. If you have pre-existing conditions, that's going to deny you coverage for certain aspects of your insurance.
Yeah, I was also going to say it's like driving insurance and driver's insurance. Right. I mean, if you've got a good record, then your rates are going to be lower, and the more crashes you have or whatever violations, your policy is going to go up, and they may not cover you. But I know, John, when we were preparing, you were talking about just limitations. I mean, it's good to have the coverage, and I know that a lot of insurance companies, or some insurance companies, pay for the communications PR agency afterwards, forensics, all kinds of things. But they also can put some limitations on what kind of tie your hands on what you can do versus what you want to do.
Well, sure. And I think when you're talking, going back to the original question, right, what are the limitations on payments? You're already seeing some limitations, maybe not a monetary cap, but there's much more scrutiny on who you're paying, and that the onus is being put on the organization to ensure that you're not paying a banned organization, or you're not paying an organization that's been marked. In my case, it's not just the U.S. I need to worry about what's on the list and from other foreign governments. So there's a process that if you're considering paying the ransom, then you need to make sure it's all square. And so that adds another element into your incident response, at least from the insurance perspective. And I want to go back because Kareem just made a great point about pre-existing conditions, because the insurance companies are now seeing that they're incentivized to go in. Jonathan said the questionnaires are just getting massive of what you're being asked. They're being incentivized to go in and do as much digging as possible to ensure that there's no pre-existing condition. And so what's happening is you're starting to see insurance companies almost turn into audit houses, where they're going to come in and they're going to perform a full audit of your environment before they'll sign off on a policy, because, right, that's your physical. That's your pre-insurance physical. And if they find something, then, okay, well, now we'll have to go back to your policy, and we'll have to adjust some of the premiums or adjust something else based on what we found in your pre-insurance physical. So I thought that was a really good point, Kareem.
Yeah, it's also, wise to, hopefully the insurance companies are, educated on the field of cyber, plus the industry that you're in, right? Healthcare and all kinds of things. So if you get somebody in there that doesn't really know, they could be putting, undue restrictions on you that you shouldn't have.
Right.
And Augusta, who asked the question about insurance, said thank you for the answer. So that was good. Okay, well, let's keep moving on. And I love your questions, so be sure to keep putting them in the chat. So now we talked about how to prepare. And so now we're in it. Now an incident happens. What do you do? I know I've talked to a lot of different CISOs, different organizations. They've got escalation processes that they have to go through. Depending on the different level, you notify different people. So John Fowler, let's go to you and talk about what happens when you're in the actual incident.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the midst of it, you mentioned the escalation process, right? I mean, that's something, should be part of your playbook. It's part of our playbook, because when there's an incident, the call comes in, this has happened. There's a group that we have that includes, again, people from all parts of the business. And then it's, okay, let's look at this incident, kind of triage what it is. What are the implications? Are there privacy implications? Are there client-facing implications? Are there operational implications? And there's a decision matrix that we have as part of our playbook. And that determines whether or not the next call is made, which is really to notify the executive team to say, okay, this has happened. this is a major incident. We're hitting the all hands button. We're opening up the incident response bridge to start discussing this and running through the playbook in all of our regions. But I think it's critical there's some kind of triage process that determines or makes some kind of verification. What's the level of this incident? Is it a minor incident? Like just from my perspective, is it an incident that's located in one office that's affecting one office, a handful of machines? Everybody's confident that it's contained, it's not going anywhere else. That maybe can stay regionalized, if you will. But some of the more major ones that start spreading, that's when you need to trigger it. That's when notifications have to go up and out across the organization.
Okay. Kareem, what are your thoughts on how to respond when you're actually in the incident?
Yeah, I think it's along the same lines as John. You have to know who is going to declare it an incident. You just don't want to go full force and say, okay, we have an incident here without really understanding all the ramifications of what that is. You can set off a whole lot of bells and whistles that are unnecessary if you haven't actually done your due diligence and investigating and verifying that what this event that's been called in, is it truly an incident? Once you get that information, like John said, you want to take it to the next level of notifying the executive team. And if you've been on the executive team or dealt with executive teams, they just want, what is it? How is it going to affect me? How are we going to get past it? They don't need all the minutia and all that. They just want to know, cut and dry, what is it? How are we fixing it? So you have to definitely have that in your playbook and understanding all the minutia of what actually goes into declaring it a full-blown incident.
Very good. I know one of the things that's important, and we should have touched a little bit on it in the how to prepare, but when you're in the incident, reaching out to the security contacts at your customers or whatever your community is that you're servicing, it's really important to have up-to-date contact information. And we, sort of ran into that where if it's not updated, it's definitely going to be an issue. So, and the other thing is an incident timeline and making sure that you've got that. Definitely something that you need to have in dealing with the postmortem. But Jonathan, talk to us about what your tips are for dealing with when you're actually in the incident.
So talking about the decision tree, John called it a decision matrix. I think that's a great analogy for it. I've always called it the decision tree. Every incident is going to have certain things that you have to make a decision on. And a lot of the playbooks are actually wrapped around those decisions. The very first decision that we look at every single time is this a life safety issue? Is there a possibility that someone can get hurt? And maybe sometimes that's not as easily, said yes or no, because, the network goes down. That means fire alarm systems goes down. You've got, people in residential halls here at the university that are asleep. You need to get someone out there and be a fire watch, in the building. So you always have to think about life safety first. And then, you kind of have a breakdown of other things you have to make decisions on. The communications, who's going to do it, how, when, and where, and why. Legal ramifications. What are you required to do? We have FERPA regulations. The Department of Education says you have to do this within 24 hours. You have to breach notifications if it is a breach. You have to make in so much time. Cyber insurance requirements. Money. There's going to be times when you have to set aside funds to pay for something, whether it's an IR team coming in, who's going to have that authority? How much money are you going to have available to you? And return to business. You have to be able to figure out when can you return to normal business? When should you not return to normal business? There are times when you have to step back and go, okay, we have to stop. We have to shut the network down. We have to shut down the service, whatever it is, because there are things that are going on in the background that it's just better for the organization to do that. So really, when you're thinking about those decisions, that you're in the middle of the incident, your playbook really has to have who's going to be making these decisions, how are they going to be making them, and who's going to communicate those decisions. Again, that incident response manager, I think, is key because they can go to the budget person, they can go to the the HR person, they can go to the controller, they can go to the physical security and general counsel, and they can start putting all those pieces into place, because that's what's the most important part, is making good decisions based off the information that you have about the incident.
Right. What would you say is the most relevant role, like before you identify, or I guess you're trying to identify who the IR manager is going to be? Who is that usually? Is it usually somebody in this cyber team, or is it IT, or is it, how do you designate who that is?
In my world, it's the CISO. The CISO is the one who has to be able to understand the business pieces of the decision making, the technical pieces of IT, the legal and the compliance requirements. They have to know at least who to go talk to. Now, there is a concept, at least for higher education, of a crisis management team. And that crisis management team is usually a select amount of leadership that's not IT, because it's, crisis management is, maybe a non-technical issue or some other issue going on. But as CISO, being part of that crisis management team is really important. And then when an incident happens, that CISO becomes, in our world, that CISO becomes that incident response manager immediately and engages with the crisis management team, because it may turn into something that escalates not just as an incident, a data incident. It may turn into a breach, or can be classified as a breach, but it may also turn into a true crisis. As a perfect example, we had an incident where we saw a person added to a security group. That turned into a huge multi-month incident, an investigation, law firms around. It was very involved, and it was just one little thing that someone says, well, that's interesting. And then you start looking into it, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it turned into something where you involve the board, you involve the leadership, but you still have that one person who's managing the whole piece to keep it. And you have a backup, of course, but you have that one person who's managing all the pieces so that everything gets done.
Very good. There's a 3-part question here, and I'll start with the first one. How do you define ahead of time when to engage the in case of emergency break glass incident response button? I'll start with you, Kareem.
Well, it goes back to your playbook. You've already run through a lot of these situations. Hopefully, you've already run through a lot of these situations with tabletop exercises and just reviewing your IR plan and your playbooks. Once you get that down, when a specific event happens, okay, yeah, we got to break the glass on this, and we have to blow all the whistles and blow all the horns to make sure that we get the attention that it deserves.
Yeah, I think too, it's important to weigh the risks. I guess identify the risk ahead of time of the type of data that you have, right? If you've got HIPAA data, which you have quite a lot of.
Yes.
So you have to assign or identify, or I guess assign a level of risk to each of that part of data, right? And then if that gets breached, that either goes to the executive team right away, or, So John, what are your thoughts on that?
I think what it comes down to, and it's something we've all touched on, as a CISO, it's important to know your vertical, but you really have to know your organization as a whole. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately you're going to be looked at as the person to say, is this an incident? Do we break the glass now? And I think, as Jonathan mentioned, it may be your job to reach out to these different teams across the organization to discuss this, to discuss, here's what we have, here's what we're doing. But in terms of, it's more, to me, a preparation issue. You do all this peacetime when everything's nice and relatively quiet, as it can be for a CISO. But this is when you have these conversations with the rest of the organization so that you can ensure you have the requisite knowledge to understand, not with 100% certainty, but understand well enough the implications of breaking that glass and what that's going to do across your organization.
Yeah, somebody on a panel recently said that there's a lot of psychology involved in a CISO role. And it's the psychology of bringing so many different leaders together to come together and, address the issue. And like you said, you just have to, work with the business leaders ahead of time to determine what is high risk and what's which will determine when you need to break the glass.
Right.
The next question is, did you first define the list of first responders, make sure they all know the process, and then have them escalate to whomever is allowed to declare an incident? Jonathan.
The answer is yes. I mean, you've got to have those processes in place. This all comes down to risk management. Your risk management processes will allow you to determine if an event is actually an incident. And then there's a whole process that goes into place to determine if that was a breach and who gets to make that decision. I don't get to make the decision if we've ever had a breach. We've had events and we've had incidents, but other people, lawyers and other people, they decide if something is classified as a breach. So that is all in that's in your plan. That's in your risk management plan that you have to determine who is going to do what role. That's the beginning of your playbook. That's the beginning of your decision-making tree. And one of the things, I kind of want to touch on from a little bit earlier that ties into this is individual employees or individual constituents in on your network. We want them to let the incident response team know, and there's a process in which they have to say, that they, get us a notification, and that someone on the team evaluates that risk and then determines next steps for the incident response manager. So we don't want that decision to be made in the department necessarily. The department needs to report that through normal processes. And then the person who's trained in incident response, who has the most experience in incident response, they look at it and go, oh yeah, we need to deal with this. Let's engage the incident response team. Let's get everyone together. Let's talk about this. And it may be a simple email back and forth, or you may get them all in a room together and say, okay, this is what's going on. This is first step, second step, third step. And you start your incident response plan at that point. So that communication comes into a normal process. You've got to have that process down. Maybe a mailbox, it may be a Teams, it may be a phone call, it may be, whatever it is. The emergency communication comes in, or the incident communication comes in, and then someone on that IR team is the one that makes the decision of what happens next based off their training and their playbook and the rules and policies of the organization.
Great. John, do you proactively designate someone as a scribe to track the timeline?
Yes, although we don't call them a scribe, but there's someone that's part of the IR team that their primary focus is essentially recording everything that gets done. Communications, calls, actions taken not only by security team, but by other teams. And their job solely is to kind of take all of this information in and synthesize it into a timeline, into some sort of document that can be used later on down the line. You'll have reporting purposes. The GC will definitely want to take a look at it. There is a person that their primary task is take all of this and put it into a readable timeline type document.
Yeah, one of the things that we did, and our CEO took the stance, is to be completely transparent, oftentimes more transparent than the lawyers really wanted him to do. But it really helped. And also we created a trust center on our website. So we put everything there, and anybody could go, journalists, customers, anybody that was that needed information, and we kept it up to date often. So there's a question: are there any incident response plan or cybersecurity plan templates or examples available? And somebody actually just answered it. Thank you, Nadia. Incidentresponse.com has some playbooks, and I can share some things. We did another webinar recently about it, but let's hear from the panel.
There's definitely templates out there. I'm a big fan of not recreating the wheel. So you always can go out there and use resources that people have already created. NIST has IR templates and things of that nature. I think you just said the incidentresponse.com. There's a plethora of templates out there that you can use. You just got to find the right one to fit your needs.
Okay. Jonathan.
Yeah, NIST 861 is a good starting point. Here's my warning to anyone who's doing. When you have a framework, any framework, you have to take that framework and incorporate it into your organization.
Yep.
So the framework that you get from NIST or ISO or any of those, great starting point. But you have to be able to, take the pieces that are the most pertinent to you and add in pieces that's most appropriate for you, for your organization. But absolutely, I would say start with the NIST 861. That's a great one. There's a lot of them out there.
John, anything else to add on that?
Google's your friend.
Yeah.
You can find a wide range of resources from free to, pay a little to a lot.
Yeah.
So they are out there and available for you.
Yeah, we just did a webinar on incident response on CISO Street, and one of the executives from Mandiant was on there and somebody asked that question, and you could either watch the replay or we're going to post it on CISO Street, some options. He gave 5 different areas or ways that you can access this information. So, but Google is your friend. That's, Google, you can figure everything out. Okay, so let's go on to postmortem. Thank you everybody for the questions. These are great questions. And we've got about 10 minutes left. And let's talk about conducting the postmortem, which oftentimes, I don't know, I guess I want to say it's the most important, but it is an important, obviously, part of it, especially when it comes to trust with your customers and running your business and things like that. So let's start with you, John Fowler.
Yeah, and we talked about this in some of the prep. One of the things, it just recently came out, the Equifax security report, I thought was a phenomenal piece of client relations / crisis management on the tail end / transparency efforts that I've seen, because it's an effort to reach a wide audience to say, here's what happened. Here's what we've done over the past 3 years to get to this point where we are. And let me tell you where we are now. I think something like that obviously doesn't work for every organization, but this concept of, you mentioned it, earning back trust, and whether that's public sector or private sector, that has to be part of the postmortem effort. Once it happens, you're tagged as, that place where this happened, or you're that organization where this breach occurred. So there is a significant amount of PR that has to be done to build up the trust again in your organization. And that's internally and externally, because internally, I've talked to some colleagues where they've had an incident and the rank and file kind of loses faith in the security team because, hey, we had this incident. You guys are supposed to be protecting us in essence and having this built up. So there's a lot of work to be done internally and externally. But the Equifax report, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. It really is a good document.
Yeah, it's amazing how the people that get breached turn to be, we're the victims too, right? Those companies are the victims too, but so many fingers get pointed, and it's really a challenging time. Kareem, let's hear from you on what to do postmortem.
Yeah, kind of going back to, like you said, building back trust. And this is one of the reasons why you see a lot of companies do not report the incident, because that lack of trust in your customer base. But I say everything in security is about learning and improving your processes. When you have an incident, you want to do that, the lessons learned, see how you can improve upon your processes, maybe even your technical implementations, just to make sure things run more smoothly in the future, so you can tell your customer base and all your stakeholders, internally and externally, this is what we're doing. This is how we're going to continue to improve our processes to make sure that we either prevent or decrease the extent of the damage that may occur in the future.
Yeah. John, how would you like to discuss the postmortem?
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone said about all the different pieces. The one thing I'm going to add is you have to also take into account the impact it's had on your staff, your security staff, your incident response staff. In some cases, we're talking about long hours, and during the investigation, depending on the type of incident, you could be investigating colleagues, wrongdoing, or friends wrongdoing. You could be dealing with content that may be very offensive, depending on, again, the type of incident that's happened at the organization. So as a good incident response manager, I think it's important to also, take into account everything that we've done, rebuild your playbooks as needed, update your decision-making tree, your contacts, all the different things. But don't forget about those people who were doing that incident response and making sure that they understand, number one, the value that they've added to the organization, because sometimes it's a thankless job. Number two, that they're okay with dealing with incidents. You'll get people in that they should not be in an incident response team. They just, the stress or you need to understand how that team member fits in. And sometimes the best fit is to not be on that incident response team. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just they don't like the stress. They can't handle the stress, or, there's ethical dilemmas, or, all these other things that you have to think about. So take care of your people. I kind of started in the very beginning. You always start with thinking about people. At the very end, you're still thinking about people, your customers, your staff, the world, your employees, yourself. That's where I look at it from.
That's a really good point. So we've got just a few minutes left, and I'd like each of the panelists to go around and just talk, highlight the 3 tips that you have for people about how to put together an effective incident response plan. We've talked a lot about it, but just summing it up. So I'll start with you, John Fowler.
Yeah, like I said at the very first question, get a playbook in place. And honestly, if that playbook is 3 lines, let the CEO know, or let top execs know, investigate, finish. That's the start of a playbook. Get something started, get it in place so that you can start communicating that out to employees and make sure that they know where it is, so that if they're part of this process, they can get to it. I think second is understand your organization and how they will respond. Jonathan's talked about the people, and that's just an incredible thing to keep in mind. But this is a crisis. An incident occurs and there will be a crisis in your organization. How are your people going to respond? Not just your people on the security team, the whole organization. You don't want the rogue employee who fires off maybe an anonymous email to, pick your publication or pick your website. You want employees to understand that everybody's involved, everyone's got some sort of role to play. And I think the last thing is, we just talked about it, be as transparent as you can be. I'd love to say be completely transparent, fully transparent. The lawyers, I think, if they're listening, will have a heart attack if they hear that. So be as transparent as you're allowed to be. That's how you're going to build up that trust again with your customers, build it up internally, for people to see, here's what we've done. Here's the process we followed. Here are the improvements we're making. Yes, we know, we identified a lack of X, but here's how we're addressing that. I think that's crucial as part of the IR process.
Yeah, very good. I agree with you. And I know that the number one thing that we had got feedback on was how transparent we were in the whole incident. So it's important. Kareem, what are your 3 tips?
Well, the first tip is you got to identify your assets, and then classify those assets based on risk level. If you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. So knowing what you have in your environment, what risks may be prevalent to those assets, then you can start creating your playbook. Once you start your playbook, make it simple. There's no need for complexity when it's time for incident response. You don't want people just going all over the place. Just keep it as simple as possible, as long as you're getting the job done with that playbook. I guess a third one, I would say, make sure your IR plan kind of aligns with your COOP, with your BC and your DR plans, because many times when you're having an incident, it's not just going to be a few endpoints that are involved. Sometimes it'll take down your whole operation. We all remember Colonial Pipeline in very recent news. So making sure that you align your plans with the different types of recovery and continuity plans in your organization as well.
Very good. And Jonathan?
So my 3 tips for everyone is, we've talked about the plan, the playbooks and the plan. Number 1, have your plan. Also be prepared that your plan is going to change. When everything hits all at once, you need to be prepared to move and be agile and be prepared to deal with situations as they come up. The other thing, or the second thing, is you need to train as if it was real. Because when it's real, you're going to do as you were trained. Now, this is a concept we do in martial arts all the time. You train as if it was real, because you're going to fall back on your training when it's real. You don't have to be creative. You just fall back on your training. And, talking about the transparency thing that John was talking about, one of the things that I got and that I hold dear is don't lie. Whatever you do, don't lie. If you're talking about when you're doing communications, if you don't know, say that. Say you don't know. Yeah. If you're talking to your leadership and you say you don't know, say it. You don't want to say something and then not be true. You don't want to say something to the community and then not be true, or to the public and not be true. It's always better to say, I don't know. We are finding out. Yeah. There will always be an expectation that you do know, and that's appropriate. But don't ever lie. Always tell the truth. Now, how much of that truth, that's based on what your organizational risk level is and what your general counsel is going to let you do. But my advice is don't ever lie.
Very good. And I know that we mentioned the lessons learned on this, and CISO Street, we're going to be running a panel in beginning of June. And we're going to have executives from Microsoft, FireEye, and a partner from a law firm that handles cybersecurity, and a CEO from a company that was breached, talking about lessons learned. Mm-hmm. So it should be very valuable information. So I hope you'll check that out. But I want to thank the panel for joining us. I know the audience enjoyed it. A lot of good questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kim.